The floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much indeed for the invitation to speak to you today. I sincerely apologise for not being in Norwich. I would love to be there. I would love to spend some time with you all in the pub discussing at our leisure, but unfortunately, coming over just for a day or so these days is just a bit too complicated. Maybe just to say as well, I know the region fairly well. I did my PhD actually in the fens around the River Ant, around the Norfolk Broads, as an ecology student from Sheffield, but then moved into agriculture afterwards. Anyway, let me share my screen and let's take it away. If you could maybe nod that this is working. Yeah. So what I want to do today then is to talk essentially about a topic that I have been working on a lot for the last actually 4 or 5 years, trying to, if you like, envisage what's going to happen with farming in the future across the world. And it's very different, if you like, from a seminar I gave last time I was with you in Norwich, which was very much focused on our work on nitrogen fixation in legumes. I will use a couple of pictures of legumes at some point, of course, because I can't resist. But here we are. It is actually taken in a supermarket in the United States. Our core value, promoting the health of our stakeholders through healthy eating. Food, healthy eating is so much part of the agenda these days, right through all of the popular media. Everybody has an opinion about it. Everybody has opinion also about how food should be produced. So it's really a problem to which we're all very, very much engaged. Now, just to give a quick outline, I'm going to talk first of all around this problem. What is the problem of global food security? Move on to discuss more global trends in farming, and then a real focus onto this idea of sustainable intensification in Africa. I'll mention what I call then this food security conundrum, which I think is for me the biggest problem. How can we solve this conundrum? And I'd love some input from you all at the end of the seminar. And then I'll give a couple of more maybe amusing examples about learning from history, think about the future prospects, and I'll end up with some conclusions which in a sense are more questions than conclusions, to be honest. So all of our work is framed, and the work I do with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, really firmly around SDG 2, ending hunger and promoting nutrition and sustainable agriculture. But that's highly linked to SDG 1 because so many of the smallholder farmers in the world are basically under the poverty line. So these days, everything's framed in this idea of global food systems. We had the United Nations Food Systems Summit in September. The FAO report there of the state of food security and nutrition is transforming food systems. And I contributed to this report of IFAD, their Rural Development Report 2021, Transforming Food Systems for Rural Prosperity. And the paper that we published in the journal Food Security is actually a short version of a 70-page report, which is still to come online with IFAD, which actually goes into many of the issues that we discuss in the journal article in more detail. So the background for all of this for me is very much this idea that there are going to be these major shifts in the world population. We're all talking about this idea that there's going to be an extra billion people by 2030, and a lot of that extra billion is actually going to be in Africa. But look at the projections. I mean, this is what actually terrifies me. The projections are that there could be as many people in sub-Saharan Africa as in the whole of Asia combined by the end of the century, because population growth in Africa is very, very rapid, and it's not slowing down, not at the moment. Now, there was a recent report from Fawcett and others which actually would suggest that the population will start to attenuate around 2060, but I've been talking to some demographers and they think that some of the assumptions made in that report are also maybe not valid. So this is based on the United Nations projections. And when we think about food demand, then we know that as you get economic growth, it's a lovely graph here from Dave Tillman and colleagues in PNAS, as basically the per capita GDP increases, then we see this increase in consumption. Obviously, often not the healthiest of diets, but basically this coupled together with population growth means that there is an increasing demand for food. And I put up this slide because obviously people say, yeah, but we can reduce losses. Absolutely. We can change our diets. Absolutely. So that'll reduce demand. But even if we do everything we can with reducing losses and reducing demand, we still need to continue production and to produce more than we're producing today. So in many of my food systems discussions here in Wageningen, in our interdisciplinary groups, everybody's saying, yeah, but now we need to just focus on losses, or we need to change diets. And it's not an either or, it's an and. Yeah, we've got to do all of these things to actually meet the demands of the growing population. So if you think now, well, where's the food produced? In the darkest colors here, these are the major exporters. So this is the cereal self-sufficiency rates for different countries. And you'll see that the United States, particularly North America, South America, Australasia, big exporters of food. Africa there in the center of your graph, actually many of the countries with the least self-sufficiency for cereals. And then if we look at the Global Hunger Index, you'll see Africa very much focused out together with South Asia largely and some other places, but a big focus here on Africa because of this problem then of global hunger being focused in Africa and the lack of food self-sufficiency at national scales. So the main messages of this sort of introduction then, when we think about this global food systems perspective, we have to think of all of these pillars of food security, the availability pillar, which has got a lot to do with production. Of course, access, because we know that there is enough food in the world, but it's simply that many of the poorer people can't get hold of it. Utilization, of course, that's a lot to do with nutrition, and then sustainability in terms of the means of production, particularly. But to actually offer these nutritious and healthy diets for everybody needs a continued focus on food production. We can't escape from this. Now, at this point, many talks usually flip and start talking about things like regenerative agriculture, organic agriculture, agroecological approaches. All of these different words used to describe farming, family farming. And that's often juxtaposed against the current situation. We've got to escape from industrial, large-scale, conventional farming. And in a couple of papers that I've put on this slide here, we sort of contest this dichotomy, really. And we've got another paper actually coming at the moment, which is entitled, How do we define conventional agriculture? And I put this up because basically we would argue that agriculture across the world is nearly all family farming. And that's something that I really want to go into detail in this talk. So almost all farms, you could argue, are conventional family farms, 99% of the farms across the world. So, and here I know Arjan's an economist, so this is really basic economics. Farming depends on land, labor, and capital. The two main resources, and then of course capital needed for investment. Now if we put global farming systems against this, so here we've got on the bottom axis land area going from low availability to high availability. The vertical axis we've got low availability to high availability, and I'll talk about labor and mechanization in a minute. We tried to sort of frame where are all these different types of farming systems and where are things heading in future. And what we see is in areas where there's quite a lot of land availability and high capital availability, we see massive expansion of farms, farms of 10,000 hectares or more, often farmed by one or two people, yeah, massive areas. In Brazil, we see something the same, but here there's more expansion, not only expansion into existing farmland, what we're seeing here in Australia, which is expansion of the farm unit. Of course, in Brazil, we're worried very much about the expansion of the agricultural area at the same time. If we move over to this side on lower land availability, then, of course, in Europe, and particularly here in the Netherlands, where I'm living and where I'm based, we see a massive intensification. We see pig production, poultry production, which is virtually land-free. We see greenhouse horticulture, for instance, highly intensive, very capital-intensive, very high economic value, but very small in land area. Dairy's a bit in the middle here, but with big expansion of dairy herds and decreasing farm numbers. And then down in this corner, we've got low capital availability and low land availability. Now, in some parts of Asia, we see progress of intensification. The Green Revolution will be a good example. Some evidence, but not that strong, for consolidation of farms in Southeast Asia, that farms are actually starting to get bigger. But what we see in sub-Saharan Africa particularly is what we call this progress of marginalization of farms, basically population growth leading to subdivision of land, leading to smaller and smaller farms, and actually decreasing yields. With some evidence in other parts, and this would particularly be in some of the more land abundant areas of West Africa, some of the areas of southern Mali where we've been working, where you still see farmers extensifying in terms of increasing the area that they farm. But essentially, on this axis here, which is really about scale enlargement, we can juxtapose these massive increases in farm area from the opposite, which is this, what we'd call marginalization. Here's an example of the sort of machines that are used here in Australia. There's a picture from my colleague John Kierkegaard. These huge machines which can sow very accurately seed at 5 centimeters depth. They're putting the fertilizer at 8 centimeters depth. They can farm, they can actually sow very accurately, GPS steered, 500 hectares in a day, yeah? And it still takes a farmer 20 days to get around the farm because he's farming 10,000 hectares, yeah? But I mean, a massive scale of operation. And this is precision agriculture. It's extremely efficient use of inputs, to be honest. Now, this is an older slide I stuck in here, thinking about farming as a family enterprise. And this is on the vertical axis, the number of workers per farm against the log scale of the hectares per farm, going from tiny up to 1,000 here in terms of hectares. And what we see here is that largely there's less than 1 employee per farm across this range. And in these different countries in green here, these are the family members. So 1 to 3 family members working in farms, even when you get to 100 or 1,000 hectares, because of course mechanization is used to substitute for hand labor, where we have more hand labor, if you like, manual labor down at the smaller farm end. So increasing farm area doesn't create a huge amount of employment, and this is something we need to keep in mind. Now, I need to put this in just to let you know that I'm aware, but there are some farms which are really getting bigger, where you're getting investment of capital investment of companies in farming. Here we've got Spearhead Farms, which farm 90,000 hectares in the EU. They have farms in both Western and Eastern Europe. These are basically then companies which employ farm managers. And this is, if you like, something of a new or newer trend that we see. Here we have Ingleby Farms, farming with nature, very glossy publicity they have on the internet. They actually have farms across the world. It's impossible for me to estimate how many thousands of hectares they're farming, but they're farming very large areas. And they're a listed company. They work on investment, and they, again, employ farm managers. And they're actually, if you look at their publicity, they're very much focused on crop diversity, animal welfare, farming with nature, doing it well, yeah, but very, very big scale of operation. But these really globally have to be the exception. If we look at employment, and this is against ag production for high income to low income countries, you can see the proportion of people employed in agriculture is very low, where there's agricultural production is a low part of GDP, up to very high levels here, 75, 80% or more employed in agriculture. And this graph actually on the left shows it better, really. Agricultural employment, so here take an example of Ethiopia, around 70% of people employed in agriculture, but very, very little added value per worker, versus here the Netherlands, which has got, yeah, about almost the opposite trend, yeah, so very, very few people in agriculture, but very, very large income per worker in agriculture. I put this in because, of course, agriculture isn't just about providing food, it's also about providing employment and opportunities for income for farmers. I won't say much at all about India, but I work with these people, Sudha and Avinash from IFPRI, excellent researchers, and they did a super bit for our report and for our paper, where they show that also in India, the smallholdings are actually shrinking in size. So over a period of about 15 years where there was good data, the number of holdings larger than 4 hectares halved. The share of those less than 2 hectares rose to 86%. And I think this is a shocking statistic, which really sticks in my mind, that 72% of holdings were what they call ultra small scale farms of less than 0.5 hectares. And I actually live on a very small farm here on the edge of Wageningen, where we have a few sheep. And I mean, this is the sort of area of a big garden. Yeah, and we're talking about postage stamp sizes of small holdings, but these are still classified as farmers, although of course they earn a lot of their money off farm. And we've heard, I think all of us, about the protests in India, which I think is still ongoing, of particularly farmers from the Punjab, about the change in laws, because of course the Indian government trying to reform the agricultural sector, but then potentially undermining the livelihoods of those living on smaller farms. So what's the challenge? What's the opportunity? This graph shows a base year of 1961, and looking at then what's been the change in yield since 1961 against the change in area harvested. So starting point here, and you'll see that in Europe, yeah, yields have gone up, as in North America, and actually the area farmed has been going down. Yeah, we've had set aside, we've been putting land out of agriculture. If we look at the trend in Latin America, with a rather slow start, it then has meandered up here to these massive increases in yield. And this would be really the examples of Brazil and Argentina, which would be dominating these big changes in yield. In Asia, big increases in yield and production, particularly this is the Green Revolution. And in Africa, well, yields have been increasing, but it's sort of meandering across the graph here. And the majority of increase in production has been through this increase in land area, the area being farmed. So crop yields in Africa are remaining very low. There's an increasing demand in Africa as the population is rising fast. There's an urgent need to increase production. So maybe this is the opportunity that we have for smallholder farmers to increase their yields and to increase their income. And here we have a graph from a map from the Yield Gap Atlas showing that yields in Africa currently are only something of 10% of what they could be. So we really around 1.5 tons, when the potential yields can be as high as 8 to 10 tons or more, if we're thinking of cereals like maize. We did work, actually, I won't talk about it today, on cassava in West Africa. cassava yields currently 8 to 10 tons of fresh fruit per hectare. And in some experiments we set up, which we really tried to push the boundaries, we actually achieved over 100 tons of fresh fruit per hectare, so 10 times current yields. There's a massive opportunity there to improve, to increase productivity. And this is an old slide I took in Zimbabwe, where you can see here this problem of poor soil fertility, nitrogen deficient maize versus fertilized maize, and a clear example that we can boost productivity today using existing technology, but it's not happening. And that's what I want to focus on a bit in the rest of the talk. So why isn't this happening? And we've been doing a lot of work trying to understand the situation of smallholder farmers. This is a study we published in PNAS in 2015, where we looked, and I'm going to show a lot of these graphs, so I should explain them. So across the bottom here, we have a rolling average of 13,000 farms, a rolling mean, and then on the vertical axis here, we've got food availability. And this is a bit of a funny statistic, but what we've done here, we've converted all of the income into food using maize equivalents. And bear with me, it's an approach which makes a lot of sense if we're thinking about food security. Once you get above the food security threshold, maybe it doesn't make quite as much sense. But it allows us to actually look at different forms of income and what are they contributing to food security. Now, the first thing to note, whoops, wrong arrow, from this graph is that 37% across this 13,000 households from 93 sites across 17 countries. So 37% are food insecure. If we look at food consumption, you can see the green, that as you get wealthier, then of course food crops are being sold for cash. We've got cash crops, we've got livestock, but we've got an increasing dependence as well on off-farm income. And all of those incomes tend to increase for those who are more food secure. Now, this was a first cut of an analysis which was done based on bringing together surveys from many, many different projects. And we've been exploring some of these different approaches to look at data since. In a paper that we've just published, it's a companion paper to our paper on who will be the farmers of the future. And it's a title we call, well, farming for food for income or for lack of better options. And this is data that we've taken from the Living Standards Measurement Survey, so the World Bank data. It's said, as I understand, to be the gold standard of farm household data in Africa, and it's only available for a limited number of countries, which we've analysed here. And what we've simply done is we've looked at the distributions of farm size. So this is a density against farm size. So we're looking then is where are the median farm sizes in these populations. And you'll see this massive skewness. We've actually done this for different agroecological zones, although they don't show as much as we'd have imagined. They show this massive skewness, but the shocking thing is if we think where's the median, in nearly all of these graphs, the median is way below 1 hectare. And this is very different from all of the bigger global studies that have been published talking about smallholder farm size. And we actually think that this is more accurate than most of those other studies. It's something we can discuss later, because what they tend to do is that they tend to take estimates of crop area, estimates of population and household size, divide one by the other, and they come up with a farm size. And I think actually the methodology they're using is very misleading, something we could discuss. But farms are small, no doubt, and the worrying trend is that they're getting smaller. Now, if you think about zero hunger, we've taken data from household surveys from 6 different regions that we know pretty well. So these are areas where we've had projects on the ground, so we know something about the farming system. We can be fairly confident that we can not only describe using this data, we can also explain what's going on a bit. And this is then using this statistic of turning everything, all income, into food. And you'll see that the degrees of food self-sufficiency, again, these are the proportion of farms from 0 to 100% of the farms in each case. You can see way less than 50% of households are food secure here in the Ethiopian highlands, northern Tanzania, the Ugandan highlands, better here, northern Ghana, very poor. This is actually the Upper East, for those who know Ghana. And here the cotton basin in Mali, really doing very well. And some of this is a bit counterintuitive for us who think about farming systems in relation to agroecological potential, because of course the cotton basin in Mali is an area with a single cropping season per year and poorer soils, actually, than we have here in the Ethiopian highlands or northern Tanzania. The difference here is that farm sizes are very, very small in the Ethiopian highlands and in northern Tanzania because of past a very long history of agriculture and because of then basically decreasing farm sizes. So that's looking at current food availability. And what we've done in this paper is we've looked then, okay, well, if we close yield gaps, what can we do then? Yeah. So for the different countries, these are the proportions of the households that achieve food security based on this food availability statistic. So that's all of their income as food. And you can see, as I indicated, in Mali, we're doing pretty well. Nearly all households achieving food self-sufficiency based on current food availability. Ugandan highlands, this is the southwest of Uganda, doing pretty well, good agroecology. But here in Tanzania and Ethiopia and in Ghana and Malawi, even if we push to 50% of the highest farmers' yield, these are, or to what we'd call the attainable yield, and that's really what we think would be the maximum boundary that farmers will be likely to get. Those of who are on the call who know about yield gap analysis, we're talking here about what we call 80% of water limited yield. So it's more or less 80% what would be absolutely maximum. And even if we push yields up there, and I'm not saying we can't actually get all of these households food secure because basically their farm areas are too small. Now, of course, what can we do? And this is my one slide on my nitrogen fixing legumes, that there are many things we can do for people's food, own nutrition, if you like. And here, this is an example of a cowpea variety which yields in the middle of the hunger season. It allows you to do double cropping. These legumes are very good in terms of not only energy and protein, but also minerals and B vitamins. So essentially, they're very good for household nutrition. So there are definitely things we can do to help to diversify the food basket, but we're not really addressing this overall issue of hunger as a whole. Now, another statistic I want to just introduce here is this one of living income, because we very often think about the poverty line, but very much and this was introduced by the International Labour Organization, particularly around the living wage for people in plantation workers, but then thinking about farmers who are not working in supply chains, who are not workers, but actually their own farmers. They've moved from living wage to living income. And this is a dominant discussion now in the value chains of cocoa, coffee, tea, you name it. How do we ensure that people in our supply chains are earning a living income? And a living income is basically looking at the basic human rights to food, the human right to shelter, the human right to health and education with a little margin on top. And we published a paper here of a simple benchmarking method where we can actually estimate what this living income is. And in many cases, a living income would be in the order of double the universal basic poverty line, the World Bank poverty line. And again, here we've got the data from these different surveys now, the households stacked up from left to right in terms of their relationship with the poverty line or the living income line. And you can see again that in the cotton basin in Mali or in the Ugandan highlands, basically we've got more households able to get above these thresholds of welfare, if you like, of income. the poverty line and the living income threshold. And when we look at intensification of those systems, so this is on poverty, you can see we can lift, actually, based on current estimates of prices of inputs and outputs, very few households can we actually get above the poverty line in the majority of these cases, and Uganda and Mali being the exceptions here. And then, of course, if we do the same for the living income threshold, which is higher, of course, that's even more depressed. And in my own work, the reason I was attracted to this idea of living income is really from the numerous times we've sat in the field together with households, with farmers, and asking them what their aspirations are from the future. Of course, people don't want to just be not poor. And if I go back to this, I mean, they want basically a good livelihood for the household. They want particularly to invest in education of their children. And, you know, to get above the poverty line is really let's say, a poor ambition if we're really thinking about agricultural development. And this living income threshold would only be, you know, the basic. It's not really looking at making everybody wealthy. It's really just the very basic that they could afford to feed and care for their families and to educate their children. So some examples for Ethiopia here. We've done some work in these areas in central Ethiopia around Hawassa, looking at these traditional home gardens. They're absolutely beautiful farming systems. We've got Enset here, what's called the false banana, which is harvested and the corn is dug out to create this starchy food. They're diverse. We've got agroforestry trees, they're intercrop with coffee and all these different food crops. They're beautiful agroecological systems. But what did we find in the study we did there? And this was a PhD study over a period of 4 or 5 years, working in the field together with the farmers. Examples such as this farming household is the husband and wife and their 5 children. This is a neighbor standing here. This farm has actually gone over to monoculture cultivation. This is cat, Mira edulis. It's a narcotic. But of course, if you want to get a living income off a very, very small plot of land, and this household's farm is 0.2 hectares, they don't grow food anymore. They grow cat to sell to the market, and they basically buy food in the market. And that's a clear choice, and one that, when we went there with a group of PhD students, we had a farming systems course for 2 weeks, students from all over Africa and Europe together in the field for 2 weeks, analyzing these systems. They went there saying, oh, this is terrible. All these farmers growing narcotics, you know, we should be encouraging them to grow nutritious food. At the end of the 2 weeks, everybody says, if I was there, I'd be farming cat, yeah, in those conditions, when you start to understand what farmers are faced with. With it being COP26, I put in this slide. It's a slide that we did as part of the CCAFS project with people from the CGIAR system in these 2 areas in Rakai and Nwoya, where we were asking farmers, how do you cope if there's a climate shock? So if there's a drought. And basically what they showed here is, well, the wealthier people and the people who've got access, they would depend more on off-farm income in the case of drought. Those with livestock would sell livestock. The poorer households would eat less. And when you actually see what people's coping strategies are, and we could show here that basically that this eat less was very strongly in a regression analysis. The smaller land you had, the more the eat less came out. It's really rather shocking. Yeah? The people who are selling assets, of course, are those who have livestock. But I mean, this is basically what we're faced with. And when we're talking about coping strategies, the coping strategies here are really showing that these farmers, in terms of their production systems, have absolutely got their backs to the wall. And this leads to what I call then this food security conundrum. In Africa, we need more food to be produced. We need more cheap, nutritious food for this burgeoning rural and urban population. And let's not be fooled with the statistics about urbanization. Rural populations are growing in Africa and continue to grow, even though the rate of urbanization is very, very rapid. At the same time, agriculture is a major contributor to the balance of payments. So it's high in the minds of the government, but actually the export is attracting more government attention than supports of smallholders because of that contribution to the economies. And that leaves us in this situation where we've got all these rural households who lack sufficient land or economic incentives to invest in agriculture, where there's this massive opportunity to increase yields. But what's the incentive for farmers to do that when they really can't earn a living income by doing so? Now, I want to switch off from this rather depressing story and give you a couple of examples, first of all, to maybe help you to think about things. And one of them goes back to my first project in Africa. This is in the late 1980s. I started working in Africa in 1986 in the Usambara Mountains, looking at beans, Phaseolus beans. And these hillsides are just covered in beans. That's all you can see in this slide is beans, 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 with a little maize down in the valley. Now here we are on the market in 1987 and in 2014 when we were there doing a survey. So a comparison, here's the market in 2014. It's now inside rather than out in the open. Here's the crops in 1987, the crops in 2014. Actually not that much difference in terms of production. We're still looking at basic issues of soil fertility, more or less the same problems we were looking at in my first project nearly 35 years earlier. Nothing's changed. But one thing that's changed is here am I in 1987 and here am I before you now, and the hair's thinning. I'm just about the same height. But anyway, if I was standing in front of you, you'd see. But there we were then, here we are now. But what's changed? Well, in this area, I found this fantastic PhD, which I read in Dutch, all 500 pages of it. The Oost-Afrikaanse Schweiz, it's talking about the East African Switzerland, if you like. And it's a history from 1870 to 1930. And what it says is that in 1912, there are these quotes which are saying, the plateaus are almost bare. Land's so densely occupied, it's no longer personal. There's a Malthusian crisis. This is 1912. And there's this painting, which is reproduced in the thesis, showing these bare plateaus. Move on to 1946, under the British. The people are in the final stage before the worn out land ceases to carry them. Every baby is a burden that can no longer be borne. And then we've got here work in the CGIAR, looking at cultivation, declining carbon. This is now 2016. And what we've done is we've actually documented projects from 1890 right up until the current day, which are going in doing the same analysis of these farming systems. We're still to publish this. We've got a great story coming, honest. So the population that we can see is increased in this area. I don't have this on a hectare basis, but in this area of the West Usambara has gone from around 70,000 to almost tenfold, to 500,000 people living in the area. And here's 1900, here's a picture I took in 89, fairly bare. Here's a picture in 2015, and actually there's more trees now than there were then back 100 years ago. So why hasn't there been a Malthusian disaster? Well, basically, it's this diversification of livelihoods. Here we are, scratching our heads, looking at these poor crops in the uplands, when essentially these are the houses that people are building with satellite dishes. There's intensive cultivation in the valleys, which is vegetables for the market. And this, basically, these vegetables go every night, 4 hours down the road, to Tanga or to Dar es Salaam, to the markets. So the staple crops remain on the upland. They're important for food security, but they're not being invested in. And the households essentially surviving off remittances from family members living in the cities and on cultivation of high-value crops. And it's a maize deficit area where maize is brought in and sold in the market. And this is how basically the Malthusian crisis has been avoided. But then the question is, can you carry on in the same way in the future? And this dependence on off-farm income isn't just limited to peri-urban areas. Here we can show in different areas in Uganda the median contribution of off-farm income, and you can see also the Kamarajong up in the north. You've got areas where there's high dependence on off-farm income, even though you're far from urban centres. Now, a little test for you all. I don't know if people can wave hands. Maybe I'll have to answer this for myself. Which country was successful in achieving food self-sufficiency? And these are steps that were taken. Modernization policies using new technology, consolidation of fragmented fields into viable farm units, policies to get rid of the unviable farms, to get people out of farming, tariffs and price support for a living income for farmers, and then special measures for those on the poorer soils. And this was all funded through a large injection of foreign aid. I can't really see if there's anybody trying to answer. I don't know. Arjen, would you like to answer this question? Do you know? You're the one person, or Matthew, are the two people I can see.
I was going to guess that it was the Netherlands.
Well, you're right. You're from the Netherlands. So here we are. Mansholt. This biography of Sicko Mansholt, great story. But yeah, I mean, what did they achieve? Mansholt was the architect of the Common Agricultural Policy, and it was a multi-layered policy addressing all sorts of different levels. And what did it achieve? Well, reduce the number of farms, consolidated fragmented land, modernized agriculture, achieved food self-sufficiency, and that was the major goal after the war, of course, and turned, after the Second World War, and it turned Dutch farming into this motor of economic growth. But what happened? Well, we've gone, this is, we updated this graph a year ago, but you can see the total number of farms has gone down. There are now only around 60,000 farms left in the Netherlands compared to 400,000 in 1950. And how did that happen? Well, migration. A lot of Dutch farmers left the Netherlands for pastures New Zealand, Australia, North America, also in Africa. Industrialization, of course, pulling people away from farming and urbanization. But this is actually a graph of average incomes of farmers relative to all professions, including or excluding subsidies. And it's basically simply to show that farming, also here in the Netherlands, is not necessarily that lucrative compared to other professions. Yeah, and this is true for all of Western Europe, despite all the money poured in through European Union subsidies of the Common Agricultural Policy, you name it. So farming still actually got very tight margins, and that's leading then to this increasing scale of farming in the Netherlands, and continually farmers going out of farming as time goes on. And of course, if we think about diversification of income here in the polder, in the Flevoland, in the Netherlands, many farmers earning just about as much from their energy generation as they are directly from farming itself. So diversification of farming income is also something that happens across the world. Now, what do we have now? We have a greener Europe. We have this green growth policy for Europe, and this was a briefing paper that just came out a month ago. But will this be at the expense of Africa? And basically, we're pushing to reduce production in Europe, to go more organic. But basically, that means that our environmental footprint in Europe is going to increase in terms of pushing our consumption footprint to other parts of the world. And this is a very useful report, I think, which addresses that and actually thinks that Africa is going to be particularly affected. It could actually increase pressure for land use change and greenhouse gas emissions in Africa. So we're exporting the problem. I think in the UK you call it offshoring, but of course in Europe you don't quite have the same connotation. not being the island state. And, you know, at this point, I suppose I should wave my Dutch passport at you, having just had, because of Brexit, to change or to add a nationality. And what does it mean for the future? I mean, this is a graph here with current number of people per hectare of cropland in Africa. It's already pretty high in terms of 8 to 12 people per hectare. I showed you that already in relation to farm areas. So if we're going to stop expansion of cropland, we need to boost productivity. This is actually the situation for 2050, based on population projections. If cropland expands, if we don't expand cropland, we're going to have this sort of population density in terms of the numbers of people per hectare. So the pressure for agricultural expansion in Africa is huge. And that means we need to boost productivity, and soil fertility is a key part of that, including using fertilizers. And I know this is the point that a lot of people raise their arms and say, you can't do that. I'm afraid to say it's going to be essential. I got some slides here. There were so many things that came out of our report. But just to reiterate, in a sense, and I'm summarizing now in 3 slides, if we're going to address hunger and poverty, we have to look at food production in Africa, because global production for Africa can't achieve SDG 2, and certainly not SDG 1. We know that if we want to reduce poverty and hunger, that agricultural development is probably still the most direct method, even for the poorest households. Yeah? So because I'm giving you this rather gloomy picture of what agriculture can do, doesn't mean we shouldn't be investing in agriculture, because we have few other opportunities. But we're questioning this idea that economic development will be driven by agriculture. And if you look at the current policy documents of the CADAP and everything else, it's all talking about agriculture as the driver of economic growth. And agriculture is going to be very much part of the story, but it has to go hand in hand with development also of other sectors in the country outside agriculture. And this really means then that we need a drastic rethink of policy to support agriculture in Africa if we're going to achieve SDG 2. On a more global level, if we continue with current policies, there are going to be fewer farms and ever-increasing farm sizes in developed economies, because the margins are so small, it's pushing for bigger and bigger farms. And at the same time, a large proportion of the global population is involved in smallholder farming, and that will continue to grow. And we could argue that overall this is jeopardizing the stability and resilience of the global food system, and it's certainly undermining biodiversity and ecosystem services. So my final conclusion slide then is this, that we can't think about transforming the global food system without thinking about a wider transformation of our global and regional economic systems. We blame the food system, but basically the food system is responding to free market economic signals that we give it, including all of the policies around it. And we have to look at the food system within our broader economic systems. There are huge differences in farms and farming across the world. I think that's one thing you must take away from this talk. But the bottom line is, because of this leveling, if you like, of global food prices, those farmers compete in these global markets. And if we want to rethink this future of farming to fulfill these needs of nutritious diets for all and to provide appealing livelihoods for farmers, we need an absolutely radical reform of farming and agriculture in total. So I finish with a word of thanks to many co-authors here on the reports that I've been talking about, to IFAD, Dutch Science Foundation, the Gates Foundation, and many others for funding our work. And I'd like to leave you with this slide, which is to invite you to the table. And the table is a a forum for debate and discussion, which we're running together with Tara Garnett at the University of Oxford and the Swedish University of Life Sciences at SLU, which is there online, and we're actually trying to engage and to further debates such as the topics that I've been talking about today. So thanks very much. And I say I overwent my allotted time or my planned time a little, but apologies for that.
Thank you very much, Ken. That was excellent. Very clearly delivered and extremely informative. Very, very good. So it's now time for questions. So if you have a question, you can either raise your hand or put a Q in the Q&A box, and then I will give you the mic. Or you can type it there, and then I will read it out.
Shall I stop sharing my screen, maybe?
Maybe that's good, yeah. Okay. John is asking if you still have the shorts, but John has also raised his hand, so let's give the mic to John.
I just simply say, John, that the styles of shorts have changed considerably since that picture was taken, and I wouldn't be seen dead in shorts like that anymore these days. So, sorry, it's going dark here.
John, can you come on mic? That is assuming that you have another question then about the shorts as well.
Yeah, I think it's just coming online, I think. There we go.
Can you hear?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So you can hear me, but you can't see me, which is absolutely fine. So so great to see you, Ken. Yeah, and really good presentation. So thanks very much for that. I think it's a great analysis. I suppose my question, or part of it is, you didn't quite say this, but you seem to be saying to me that, you know, for those farmers, and there's huge numbers of them now, you know, where the land holding is so small, is so tiny, that it's never really going to be viable as the main means of satisfying, you know, certainly livelihood security, but even household level food security. That the best option is probably just to facilitate people's movement away from farming, out of farming. You use the word diversification. So are we really talking in terms, you know, in practical terms about, you know, helping people move into cities, move away from farming, improving mobility, improving urban employment, improving, you know, education, all these sorts of things? Is that the answer for this majority? You know, is this what the governments and the NGOs should be focusing on in these regions, rather than trying to improve productivity? Is that what you're saying, or is there a kind of a third way, which is recognizing that many of these rural dwellers want to stay in these rural areas, and it's just that lack of opportunity, particularly for younger people, you know, in terms of adding value to produce, getting involved in other activities. So rather than sort of having to move into the cities, being able to stay in these rural areas, offering other opportunities. That's really my question. Hopefully it's clear.
Sure. No, absolutely, John. I mean, I think, you know, how do you present a talk like the talk I've given and be really positive about it? And of course, we don't want to be negative all the time. But what I'm trying to get, and what our work and the work of many others is trying to get onto the table, is to get away a bit from this romanticized notion of the smallholder farmer, you know, and so I think we're achieving that, and I think the debate is pulling around on that. When you ask, though, you know, what is the answer? I mean, there isn't one, of course, and I think it's another one of these things where it's got to be this and that and that and that as well. And I think improving productivity has got to be part of the equation, because the way that people put in the drudgery of labor for very meager returns at the moment is absolutely not acceptable. So we need to, you know, provide means, the wherewithal for people to boost productivity, no question. Alongside that, of course, the big question is, well, what's going to happen then? Is everybody going to move to the cities? And I think what we see in Africa particularly is not that necessarily we've got just this huge growth of these massive urban conurbations, and that is happening, but the growth of smaller towns and the increasing lack of distinction, if you like, between rural areas and urban areas. So smaller towns growing, markets developing, providing new opportunities for chicken production, for diversification on farm to meet the needs of the people living in those towns. But the bottom line is really that you need jobs. And if you look across Africa, you know, the employment opportunities are very limited. And there's already pretty massive in-country and between-country migration within Africa. And job creation has got to be part of, if you like, supplementing the incomes on the farm, because these households depend very often 40 to 60% on off-farm income already. And yet those incomes are very meager, yeah? So I think it's got to be an and. And I do think that we share a responsibility for this problem, not least because of our own histories, but also because of thinking to the future with that burgeoning population and the rates of population growth are really going to put much more pressure. And of course, the pressure for migration, because if you can't solve your problems where you are, you're going to look elsewhere. So you know, people often ask me, well, what's the one thing you should do? And there isn't one thing. It's a multi-layered interventions with all sorts of different policies, I think, to make agriculture more economically viable and to provide other alternatives. And I haven't really answered your question, but it's probably the best I can do.
Thank you, Ken. I'll read out a comment by David Harris. If households with small farms adopt best practice and still can't escape poverty, it begs the question, why would they continue with agriculture and why they should adopt best practice in the first place? Perhaps this realism explains why adoption rates are so low. I think
sure.
That's the thing.
And Dave, I mean, you and I have both worked on very much this type of topic now for quite some years, and we've discussed it in detail. And I agree, but then basically we've got to change the economics around so that people can at least grow their own food. And you know, is that subsidy? Not only, it's also better prices. But I still believe that households, and I think your own work has shown this as well, and certainly the work, you know, Jim Sundberg and colleagues from IDS brought out a very good book on youth in agriculture, where farming will still be one of the options that people use alongside other options. Yeah, so it's not like it's not a black and white. I think households will always hang on to their land. It's the fallback, it's the retirement home, but it's also where they can go if everything else fails, so that they're not going to give up the land easily. And food production in those small farms will continue to be part of their food security, in addition to looking for income elsewhere. So I absolutely don't think we can write off farming of their own land as part of that broader livelihood in the future.
I'll give the mic now to Bemba Koroma, who was next. Bemba, can you ask your question?
I say this, do you still have the shorts? Thanks, John. Yeah.
Bemba, can you hear me? Or maybe I need to press allow to talk. As we're waiting for Bemba, I'll read out Nico's question. He's thanking you for a really interesting...
Can you hear me?
Yeah, excellent. Good timing. Yeah, we can hear you.
All right, that's good. Yes, thank you very much, the presenter, and thank you, the moderator. I was just curious to know that one, we are now thinking about improving on productivity, agricultural productivity, and at the same time we have a population actually increasing in the rural areas. I can vividly remember you said, whatever might be the case, population is actually increasing in the rural areas. And you can see that surely for the productivity to increase, we definitely need to focus a bit on the rural areas as far as agriculture is concerned. So what can we do? Because one of the key things he spoke about is modern technology, adoption of modern technology. But so what can we do for those rural people to be able to actually adopt these modern technologies so that at least agricultural productivity will increase? And the next one is because if population is increasing and there should be a way of tampering with that. What can we do with respect to that in terms of fertility and so on, so that at least productivity increasing and then population increasing, we can catch up with having the population increase to be absorbed into agriculture in terms of productivity, and at the same time creating employment for the increasing labor force. That's
sure. So, Baima, can I ask, where are you from yourself, just out of interest?
I'm from Sierra Leone. And I've done some work related to agriculture, definitely. Sure. In Sierra Leone, there was a time when the government shifted to, in terms of agriculture, we shifted to smallholder commercialization program, which is actually being pursued to date. Yeah. But then I was part of an evaluation team that we did for FAO, and we went around the country. At some point in time when we went to those rural areas, we were asking the farmers, when the program started, when monitoring was well in place, some were actually applying the modern technology, the new technology. Sure. But as time went on, they stopped doing it. Sure. They went back to their traditional. Sure. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know Sierra Leone well, and I think there's a huge danger of me talking about Africa, yeah, because we know it's a hugely diverse continent with very, very different situations in different countries. Mm-hmm. And it's partly one of the reasons I asked. And I mean, one of the things we did in that paper where we got at least these 6 sites, we tried to show some contrasting areas. Now, I mean, what we're talking about is not rocket science, actually. I mean, we're really talking about, basic agronomy, good seeds, disease-resistant varieties, basic inputs, and particularly trying to boost nutrient inputs, because we've shown repeatedly there's not enough organic matter just to go around to boost productivity everywhere. But organic matter needs to be used where it can. And of course, I love legumes, so boosting rotations with nutritious legumes has got to be part of it. So I don't think there's a huge problem. And I mean, in a sense, my example of cat in Ethiopia is a good example. It's highly lucrative to grow cats. Farmers put all sorts of fertilizer on it. They put all sorts of horrible pesticides on it as well. So if the economic incentive is there, farmers tend to respond, in my experience, extremely quickly. And I think there's something about changing the balance of input versus output prices to make farming more economically attractive is absolutely part of the equation. And whether that's done partly by protecting local markets, as rather than so-called free trade, or providing subsidies in different forms, or providing direct payments in terms of social protection. I mean, these are all different options, yeah? When you talk about the population issue, then of course governments can do something. And I think there again, development agencies have got a lot to answer for, because there's, think about when Bush came into power and the policies also under Trump of stopping any development programs that had anything to do with reproductive health. I mean, that they share a complicity in this. But, in Uganda, we were talking about Uganda earlier, the average age is 15.2 years, the median age of the population. So the next generation's already with us. And any intervention we have now will take another generation or more before population growth really slows down. And the best way to achieve that usually is increasing in welfare and better education, particularly for women. Yeah, I mean, so education, welfare, and population growth all tend to go hand in hand. So yeah, of course there are things we could do, and yeah, I think that's got to be one of the messages that you need to be discussing as well for your own country. Absolutely.
Thank you, Ken. I'll read out Nico's question. A really interesting presentation, thank you. As I understood it, you were talking about increased production / productivity as the #1 priority. What is your take on someone who would argue that the most pressing issue to solve is actually one of distribution? Secondly, what would be your opinion on concepts such as food sovereignty as a means to achieve the SDGs?
I absolutely agree that distribution is probably the key issue currently. But then, you know, I think there's a massive role here for potentially for social protection programs of sorts, whether they're food for work programs or direct payments or whatever, because of course, you know, we won't address all of the problems of poverty simply by boosting yields of maize. I mean, it's absolutely clear. Food sovereignty, I think this is up to the choice of the individual. I don't see, at the moment, I mean, most African countries are highly dependent on imports when it comes to basic commodities, and there are big opportunities there for their own farmers to be producing those. So you could argue that's a food sovereignty at a national level. I don't know to what extent I see food sovereignty as a particularly useful framing of discussions in the main, because I think people are often, often it depends on how you want to frame it. But of course, I mean, people are often, they'll produce part of their own food and they'll buy others in the market. And I mean, I think that's the same for most of us, yeah. I'm not sure where, you know, supermarkets and local markets come in on the food sovereignty debate. It's not something I've gone into very much.
Thanks, Ken. Next in line is Peter Emmerich. Peter, do you want to come on mic?
Hello, thank you. That was a really fascinating talk. I was wanting to pick you up on the analysis you showed comparing the Uganda and cotton basin in Mali against the other countries, and showing Mali and Uganda doing so much better. But how much of that is just due to the fact that you're only looking at the households involved in farming? In Ethiopia and in Ghana and in Malawi, there was this very long tail on the left of people who are evidently very far away from a sustainable livelihood from farming alone. So they clearly have other sources of income. So is this just people who are more diversified in Ghana and in Ethiopia, whereas in Mali and in Uganda, there is that same population who just doesn't have any farming and therefore doesn't appear on the graph, but is still equally food insecure?
A really good question. So the reason we chose these locations out of many locations we could have done is because we've got projects there on the ground. Yeah. Now in Southwest Uganda, I mean, a number of things. One is you're dealing with it's part of the Fertile Crescent around Lake Victoria, if you like, that we're moving into there in Southwest Uganda. Highland banana, East African highland banana is a major staple, together with coffee. Farm sizes currently are still quite reasonable in size, so that you're dealing with reasonable farm areas, and you're dealing with food production more or less 12 months of the year. You know, bananas are a bit like a milking cow. You can harvest bunches nearly all of the time through the year. And for those situations, perennials like Highland bananas are brilliant, yeah? So I would argue there that, and actually Highland banana is very much a cash crop being sold off to Kampala. So the Mali example, it's from the Kutiala, the cotton basin, where they receive through CMDT, the national cooperative, they receive subsidized inputs for cotton, which actually are used to boost cereal production as well. So there you've got a cash crop with government support, which is providing a lot of income for farmers. And we've looked, actually, we've published a whole suite of papers. We've been working there since 2012 in a long-term program of cyclical work, participatory work with farmers. We're looking at differentiation as well in terms of the poorer households, who are often then working within the local community as well as having their own farms. And it's absolutely clear that the poorer, we published on this a 20-year trajectory where the wealthier farmers locally, and they still wouldn't classify as being rich, of course, but the locally wealthy have been doing better and accumulating more livestock, and the poorer households have basically stayed being poor. And I think many of our societies are actually designed to keep it that way, actually. But definitely in Mali, it's a lot to do, the food security area is a lot to do with government subsidies and cotton as a cash crop, actually. And sorry, you were asking about, and then the very densely populated areas. Well, yeah, I mean, to be honest, what you realize is that people are living way below the poverty line and are largely hungry a lot of the time when we're talking about many of the poorer households in these areas. It's a fairly difficult sort of situation, to be honest, to stomach. And actually, one of the main reasons that we try and get this out is because working with organizations like the Gates Foundation, I've done a lot, is that they imagine that we're going to find the technical switch somewhere and we just flick it over and whoops, everybody's going to be fine afterwards. So, you know, that's actually driven us to producing a lot of this work to try and get this discussion on the table.
Thanks, Ken. Next is Natasha. Natasha, the mic is yours.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Sure.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Ken. Really interesting, and especially the responses to these questions afterwards. Kind of picking up at the end of what you've just said to Peter, actually, I wanted to ask about your thoughts around investments in agricultural innovation. And following what's been going on at COP in the last few days, we've seen various pledges around investment in agriculture, which are, you know, really great to see, given that historically there's not been so much emphasis on agriculture in previous COPs. But we've seen a kind of US pledging as part of this aim for climate, something like $4 billion to agricultural innovation. The climate shot has just been announced as well, and their kind of hard launch in the last few days, all focused around agricultural innovation investment. And I wanted to ask you really your thoughts about that, firstly in terms of the focus around where this agricultural innovation investment is going to be. And secondly, a sort of more a kind of naive question based on your talk is looking at the low productivity of the agricultural farmers within Africa. Should it be that sort of all of the focus of the investment of agricultural innovation should be on that continent, given the potential increases in productivity and this gap in food security and requirements that we can see opening up? Or is that just too naive in terms of a kind of conclusion to come through from the evidence you've presented us?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I'm on really shaky ground with all of this, yeah, because I mean, my speciality is nodules and nitrogen fixation, you know, when it comes down to it. And I note, and on the question and answer, there's Sheetal Patil has put in a link to a book there, which looks really interesting. So thanks, Sheetal. But I think the big difference in India, where you have very similar, is there is a lot of this social protection and direct payments for households already. Not to say that you know, of course, if we look at the world's poor, there are more poor in South Asia than there are currently in Africa, but I think that is going to switch in future. But I mean, that this idea of social protection is going to be absolutely key, I think, in future. When you talk about agricultural innovation, I mean, what worries me there a bit is that I think for a very large part of the situation in Africa, you know, we know what we need to do. We've got pretty good varieties of many different crops. We can diversify, we can provide nutritious food baskets. We've got good varieties, good technologies. And if there's going to have to be innovation, I think it's going to be where I'd really put the the investment would be, well, as we increase productivity, that means that we've got to increase inputs. Yeah, it can't be done without inputs. And if we're going to increase inputs, that's going to mean more nitrogen. That's potentially going to mean more nitrogen losses, so more greenhouse gas emissions. So if we don't do it well, if we're going to boost productivity, if we don't do it well, we could be contributing more emissions at the same time as sort of developing the adaptation for the households. Yeah. So I mean, I think looking at a climate smart, if you want to call it that, ways of producing more food are going to be absolutely key. And I'm not sure, was there a second part to your question? Sorry, I think I probably lost it already.
It was just, I think you've answered both of those really. It was just around the kind of focus of the investment. I think you're right, just coming back to you, that there seems to be a lot of focus on the kind of more technical sides from what I can hear so far, and not on the kind of social changes that are needed, the kind of capacity building, and doesn't seem so much acknowledgement of the fact that we do know a lot of the things that need to be done. There's just not been the investment historically in those areas.
You know, I mean, maybe one example would be the big focus on digital solutions at the moment. You know, the idea that everybody just needs an app and that's going to change the world. And I mean, unless we've got these multi-layered policies there to provide both, I mean, what the economists always tell us, you know, better infrastructure, roads, transport, better pricing, inputs, outputs, make it more effective. You know, all of these things are just basics that you need before any technology is going to take off. And in the nearly 40 years I've been working in Africa, I've seen examples where there have been good market signals, where things have changed dramatically, very quickly. People can be very responsive, and even on their small plots of land, proportionately, they can increase their income very quickly. Yeah. But of course, the absolute amount is not that large because the land area is small. So I think the bottom line is, and again, talking to development economist colleagues, they still would say that investing in agriculture is one of the best ways of addressing rural poverty, even though it's not necessarily going to, you know, flourish overnight. Yeah.
Excellent. Nitya, you're next. Nitya Rao.
Yeah, thanks, Ken, very much for this talk. It was really, I think it's thrown up a lot of issues. I think some of them you've touched on, but I wanted to go back to the issue of living incomes, which you raised. And you had a very interesting graph that even in Europe, the living incomes out of farming is lower than in other professions. And so I'm assuming that this is the same across the board. At least I know in South Asia and in India, this is definitely the case, that even if you're a so-called progressive farmer, your income from farming is going to be less than if you were working in a computer-based or any other kind of company. So I'm just wondering that, as you said, just in response to Natasha, that for agricultural improving production and productivity, we already have a lot of solutions. But I'm wondering if we take the problem from the living incomes perspective, as you did, that perhaps the intervention to boost farming and food security has to be somewhere else, which is really in sort of trade and markets and prices. That, you know, with India, I think we have a lot of experience with procurement and prices. And I think that was the success of the Green Revolution. Yeah. That the minute there was a market at a good price, I think farmers took these options of the Green Revolution package. The minute you don't have those things, they don't want to take it. So I'm wondering, you know, what you thought about that. That is there should the strategy for the future really be to try to think about how do we move farming incomes towards these living incomes, if at all it is possible. And this links to the second issue that you mentioned, I think, which was very interesting, your opening slide about the binary between regenerative versus industrial farming and the whole problematic of small farms. And I was again thinking here that perhaps, you know, we need to think creatively about institutional solutions. For instance, in India, again, if I go back, that's the context I know best coming from India, that the dairy sector, for instance, has been the big success story, because of the cooperative. So even the very small producer with one cow and producing 5 liters or 10 liters a day has actually done very well and is earning very well because of the collectivization of marketing and value addition and the market, global sort of markets. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, because I do agree with you that as far as farming is concerned, we do have a lot of solutions. I've been listening to a couple of sessions in COP26, and I think everybody was saying the same thing, that we have the solutions, but farmers are not, willing to adopt it. And so that was finally my third and last actually related point about, are we also, doing it from our perspective as scientists or people interested in food security and academics, rather than really looking at what farmer...
Sorry, the last one?
Are we focusing too much, framing the question from our perspective in terms of yields and productivity, rather than from the perspective of farmers' priorities?
Sure.
Thank you.
No, I mean, to take your last point first, I think the answer is absolutely yes. And that, what we tend to do even in our participatory work, we go in and we start asking, what are the problems of your crop production? Not where do your priorities lie? What are your aspirations? And I know Dave Harris is on the call, and they've been doing some really interesting work asking young people, what are their aspirations for the future? I think that's really important. Also, Jim Sundberg's team looking at youth in Africa have got some really interesting insights, and they're very, very diverse insights, because people want all sorts of different futures. I do still, even from my narrow perspective, think that increasing productivity's got to be part of the equation. And the example you use, like of small-scale dairy, I mean, I know again of good examples where that's worked really well. It needs some institutional infrastructure, and particularly a good market and a link then, because we're dealing with perishables, linked to that market. The real advantage of milking, of course, is that then you've got an income which is regular as well. The slides I showed of the West Usambara Mountains, where you have this vegetable production, that was kicked off in the 1980s with a lot of projects focused on vegetables, and that's a self-sustaining trade now from the Usambara Mountains. It's 4 hours to Dar es Salaam. There are trucks leaving every day at midnight, and they're in the market by 6 o'clock in the morning, and it's 400 kilometers, yeah? And that extends the idea of peri-urban, I think, quite substantially, but where there's a good market, people will produce for it. So I do think that the institutions part is absolutely a massive part of the intervention. And I think, though, it's just so that we don't do the sort of the agricultural technologists out of a job like myself, it's a matter you need the appropriate technology matched to the right institutions with the right policy and the good prices and everything all in the same place. And that's why, when people say to me, what's the one single thing we need to do? I say, but one single thing won't work, because it has to be embedded in all those other layers, yeah? And I must say, working with Avinash Kishore and discussing about the situation in India, and my experience in India is really back at the beginning of the 1980s, so I've hardly worked there since, has been really illuminating for me, because I think you're absolutely right. If we think, well, I had one project in Tamil Nadu where we were looking at rice production, and when farmers could buy their own rice to eat at 2 rupees, I think it was, in the market, and they could sell their production at 12 rupees, because that was the distortion, if you like. But then that distortion means that India is self-sufficient for rice, because farmers produce for those prices and they buy back at another price. Just raising prices on their own hits the poor, because they tend to be net consumers rather than net producers, the poor farmers. So yeah, it is complex and it is multi-layered, absolutely.
Thank you, Ken. We have 3 minutes left and 3 questions left. So I think perhaps ask them in one go, and then if you pick up on what you would like to pick up on. They can't be comprehensively answered, all of them. So there's one on the reasons for reduced productivity when land is divided. Then Sheetal confirms that in India he finds similar insights about diversification, and she's wondering whether perhaps people in urban areas can engage in rural farming as a way of having diversified livelihoods. And then Henry is asking about the role of extension in achieving the necessary goals in Africa.
On the first one, the reduced productivity is essentially that just continuous cultivation of the same plot of land without any inputs. Yeah, I mean that's it's, if you like, you'll find it always said, but it's absolutely true. That is what is going on. This continual cultivation without enough going in, and then basically you're just taking and taking and taking out year in, year out, and the productivity collapses. There was a question about extension services, and of course that's absolutely got to be part of the story. Extension and advisory, and I think there again, a lack of investment generally, alongside a lack of investment in research, but a lack of investment in extension. And Tom Jane, a development economist from the States, he always says that the best return actually would be to put a larger proportion of GDP in Africa into agricultural research and extension. So he would agree with you there, I think. And the question from Sheetal, I think she's trying to say, would there be something which would encourage people to go back to small farms? I think that's a difficult one. I mean, my understanding is that many people who work away in the cities in Africa often go back to the farm in retirement, yeah, and that they will farm on fairly small pieces of land. I can think of a lot of examples in Western Kenya where farmers are have dairy cattle because they could afford to invest, or they have tea that they produce, and that's in a sense their pension. So even on a small plot of land, they could still get, you know, enough to keep going. And that people, I don't think people in Africa are going to move to the city and give up their land so that you can have massive consolidation in the same way that you had in the Netherlands, for example, because I think people will hang on to that land as their social security for the family for the longer term and for the fallback in case things go wrong in the city. So, yeah, a lot to think about. Thanks for the questions.
And speaking of a lot to think about, I just noticed that I missed Philip Richardson's question, which is a ringing endorsement of what you're saying. But he was also asking, how on earth do we get this known to a wider audience?
Sure. I'm doing what I can, say, in terms of trying to, you know, write stuff, but not just put it in the academic media, to put it out in the public media. And I've had the privilege this year through the Food Systems Summit of having special sessions with both the ministries here in the Netherlands, the Ministry that deals with agriculture, the ministry that deals with overseas development, and with all of the agricultural attachés from their embassies actually discussing these issues. And I think, you know, if I think back 15, 20 years, we weren't welcome at all in any of the ministries, and now they're coming to us to ask for our advice. So I think we do have this opportunity now to talk at a higher policy level, and also in Africa. So I mean, it's a matter of let's if this is what we think is important, let's get out there and keep talking about it. Absolutely. So thanks, Philip.
Thank you very much, Ken. That was really excellent. So let's give Ken a round of applause if you can find the right emoji. I've just found it. But if you can't find it, then we believe that you're silently clapping.
Thank you.
Wherever you are. Thanks. That was really great.